This was not consciously planned that I would be here tonight after that particular interview, but the contrast between sort of going out into the world that we sort of don't normally go out and talk within, and then knowing that I can come home tonight. And feels really good, so thank you. Thank you. When I did my CNN town hall, once again, completely just not done on any kind of conscious level. I did a program with Eckhart Tolle in Los Angeles, and then had to get on the red eye to go to Washington to do the CNN town hall. So that also was, I felt, the universe saying, we're going to prepare you to spend an evening with Eckhart, and you'll be ready for the CNN town hall. So that was great too. Thank you. I was supposed to write a book this year about Jesus, about the metaphysical Jesus, about Jesus not necessarily for Christians, but the whole metaphysical reality of Jesus. I was very excited about it. And then one day I called my publisher and I said, you know that, the Jesus book? He said, yeah. I said, I think we need to postpone that for a few years. I want to do something first. He said, okay, and then he actually said, because publishers had not done well with my politics, he said, anything you want to do as long as it's not political. I said, well, actually. So I wanted to write a book that elucidates my feelings about politics today. Many of you know that I wrote a book called Healing the Soul of America back in the late 90s. And in that book, I talked about the corporatocracy and wealth inequality and mass incarceration and racial injustice, so many of the things that were already there. But you know, if you have a stage 1 cancer, the doctor doesn't say, well, you know, it's no big deal because it's just stage 1. And many of those things now are stage 4 cancers. But they were stage 1. And you know, the term inertia means the tendency of the object to move in whatever direction it's been moving unless and until there is a direction of a counterforce. So as some of you have heard me, because I've talked about it publicly, and that's why the publisher would say as long as it's not political, that was a tank for me commercially and as a writer. Because the spiritual audience that I was so used to speaking to did not want to hear about politics at that time. And somebody told me, even when Healing the Soul of America came out, you know, Marianne, it would have been a big hit if you had published it under a pseudonym, because the political crowd didn't want to hear from a spiritual writer, and the spiritual crowd didn't want to hear about politics. But that seems like a long time ago now. And even though I did revise Healing the Soul of America last year, and unfortunately, when somebody said, well, what did you have to do to revise it, this book about spirituality and politics in America? I said, unfortunately, everything's still the same, just much, much worse. The numbers are just worse. Everything was already there, it was already happening, and now it's even worse. But more has happened than just a revision or an extension of what was already happening in the late 90s. And that's why I wrote this book, and that's why I'm running for president, and that's why I think all of us feel that this is a moment of true urgency. It's true urgency on the planet. How wonderful that we're speaking here on Earth Day. I remember when Earth Day was started, it was just this kind of like hippie thing, you know. It was like, and I was thinking about it today because I assume that some of the people who started Earth Day probably aren't even with us anymore. And I hope from wherever they are, they're looking down and seeing what a real difference it makes. It's a profound thing and beautiful that we're here on this day. We all know that this is a very urgent moment, and we all know that it's an urgent moment on the planet, and it is particularly an urgent moment in this country. It's an urgent moment in this country, and where this country goes affects the world. And that's a burden, that's a glorious burden on each and every one of us who are citizens of the United States. When the United States gets it right, it's a great light cast on this planet. And when America gets it wrong, it's still very, very much of an effect on this planet, but not a very good one at all. And our democracy does give us more than rights. It gives us responsibilities as well. And so our responsibility when it comes to democracy is to know that this is a profound power that lies in our hands. It's a profound power that lies in our hands. We have the deep responsibility goes along with this power. And it's also not only the responsibility to other people in the world, but also the realization that it has been bequeathed to us by other generations. Many people in all of those generations suffered and sacrificed and struggled, and in many cases gave their lives so that this precious possibility could be nurtured and nourished. We, in too many cases, have majorly taken for granted. We would not be where we are today in this country had not so many of us just sort of taken all this for granted. And I think there has been an awakening. You know, I don't find politics and spirituality now like I felt in the late 90s when I wrote Healing the Soul of America. And I talk about politics. It was like, do we have to? Those days are over. It's a very different time. This has been one thing about these last 2 years in the Trump presidency. It's been an awakening. And I think we do have a greater sense of the narrative, the entire narrative of American history, both in terms of what came before us, but also in terms of what we owe to those who come after us. And so when you look at the whole story of American history, which is important, you know, I don't think that we would be where we are in this country today were it not for the fact that the average American is so undereducated about the history of this country. 11 states in the United States don't even require that students have even a half a year of civics and American history. And it's like anything else. It's like when you go to therapy and you learn about your family. You want to know where you came from, because when you don't know where you came from and you don't know the narrative that brought you to where you are, you don't know where you fit in. That could be your family, it could be your tribe, it could be your ethnicity, it could be your culture. It could be when you go to therapy, you're trying to figure out your place in all this. Too many of us as Americans don't really know our place in all this. And not knowing our place in all this, it makes us incapable of finding our power within all this. So a large part in all of the stuff I've written from Healing the Soul of America and also in Politics of Love includes a bit of a reminder about what happened here in this country. And so if you'll give me an opportunity, it has a lot of relevance today, particularly to racial issues, and that's why I particularly want to mention it. In 1776, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and let's remember, they were risking their lives to sign the Declaration, because if they had lost the war, if England had won the War of Independence, they would have all been hanged as traitors. George III called them insurgents. So they posited in the Declaration of Independence the most enlightened principles that had ever infused, the founding of any country on earth. The idea that all men are created equal, it was radical. By the way, it was radical then and it's radical now. All men are created equal. And that God gave, they were not afraid of that word, God gave all men unalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted to secure those rights. Those are America's first principles. That, and then it is considered an additional first principle, Lincoln's line written in the Gettysburg Address, that a government of the people and by the people and for the people would not perish from the earth. That's it right there. That's like learning your scales. But you know, in the Jewish religion, it says that every generation must discover God for itself. And every generation has to re-embrace the radicalism of those principles, or we are vulnerable as a nation to those who would transgress against them. That's a very big deal. If those principles are simply written somewhere, inscribed on marble walls, or written on parchment, but preserved behind glass in a museum somewhere, that's not enough. It has to be that fierce thing that rises up in us. No, we mean that. We said that all men are created equal thing. We meant that. That like inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, like we mean that. And that governments are instituted to secure those rights, we mean that. And of the people, by the people, and for the people, we mean that. The only protection of Americans' democracy greatness is you and me really meaning that. That is the only protection. Now, the irony and the tragedy of American history, of course, is that of those men, and their average age, by the way, was 30 years old. Those men who signed the Declaration of Independence, 41 of them were slave owners. So that dichotomy has been with us from the beginning. That polarity has been with us from the beginning. It's nothing new. It's been in every generation that we have both aspired to the highest principles and yet sometimes have ourselves been the greatest, even the most wicked transgressors against those principles. So this is like nothing new. This is simply the story of American history. But the narrative over time is that we tend to self-correct. Why? Because enough people rise up in their generation and go, no, we really mean that. All men are created equal. So the slavery thing's gotta go. Why? Because we really mean that. All men are created equal. So this thing of oppressing women and not letting women vote, no, that's gotta stop now. Why? Because we mean that. You know this business about how all men were given inalienable rights, and one of them is to pursue happiness? Well, since gay people often pursue happiness by getting married, they will now be able to get married. Why? Because we mean that. And it's now time for our generation, in the face of a government that has become a handmaiden to a matrix of multinational corporate conglomerates who would use the government as little more than its instrument for advocacy for their short-term profits before the health and well-being of the American people, the people of the world, and the planet on which we live. You know that part about the governments are instituted to secure our rights, and this is a government of the people, and by the people, and for the people. It's time for our generation to rise up now and say, you know that part? We mean that. But how do we do that? You know, when I wrote my book, Healing the Soul of America, one of the things that was so fascinating to me was reading about Mahatma Gandhi and reading about Martin Luther King, reading about these two really the greatest political lights of the 20th century, and how Gandhi articulated the principles of nonviolence in politics. We don't have to recreate anything. We don't have to invent any new wheels. And Martin Luther King, went to India and he studied the principles of nonviolence as articulated by Mahatma Gandhi, and he brought them back to the United States to apply them for the struggle for civil rights in the 1960s. And what Mahatma Gandhi said, and you know, Mahatma Gandhi had been very influenced by the Quakers. He had been very influenced by Thoreau. And Mahatma Gandhi talked about the fact, just as the Quakers do, that there is an inner light within every man, woman, and child. And that Quaker concept was very much a part of the founding of this country. The whole idea of the repudiation of aristocracy. You know, one of my favorite stories is about William Penn. When William Penn in England, and he was a Quaker, and the laws at that time were that if an aristocrat's carriage came by, you had to bow. Because the whole social agreement at that time in old aristocratic monarchical Europe was that only a few people, the aristocrats, the upper classes, were deemed entitled to land, to wealth, to education, to the opportunities to actualize their dreams on a material level. And no one else did. Everybody else was little more than a serf. So what you were supposed to do to make sure you didn't forget your place was that when an aristocrat's carriage came by, you were to bow. Well, there was a famous story where William Penn, an aristocrat's carriage came by, and he didn't bow. And so a soldier came up to him, drew their sword, and said, "Didn't you see that that was an aristocrat's carriage? You didn't bow. Why didn't you bow?" And William Penn, who was a Quaker, said, "My religion forbids me. My religion forbids any man to bow before any other man." Now, he did this so many times that George III said, "I got to get rid of this guy. Go to the Americas. I'll give you some land there," which was probably not in King George's best interest, because he did exactly that, and he founded Pennsylvania and so forth, which became this seat of the Quakerism and the original founding principles of the United States. So we have had, from the beginning, people who recognize that this idea that there is an inner light within all men and all women, all children, all people, it's the profound core of it all. It's why equal rights are to be given to everyone. It's why it's why the pursuit of happiness should be given to everyone. And it's why the opportunities to soar, the opportunities to actualize our own unlimited God-given potential It's a sacred thing. This is not just a matter of a new political moment in history. It was a moral and a spiritual and a philosophical step forward, completely repudiating an entire worldview that had dominated this planet for centuries. It was radical, and it's radical now, and you see even now how many, not just in other places in the world, but even in this country, you see the forces that materialize and form themselves as though to say, well, no, we're entitled, but you're not entitled. And that happens as long as there are not enough, a critical mass of Americans who get, no, that's actually not what we're doing here. That's not what we will be doing here. Now, what Gandhi said was not just that there is this inner light within every man, woman, and child, but he said that the inner light is love. And he said that this inner light not only heals personal relationships, but it heals political and social relationships as well. And that is what Dr. King was referring to when Dr. King would later say that Gandhi was the first person in human history and take the love ethic of Jesus and turn it into a broad-scale social force for good. Now, I think it takes noting that to Gandhi, it was not the love ethic of Jesus. To Gandhi, it was the love ethic at the heart of all the great religious teachings. But that was the line from Martin Luther King, and of course that was the tradition that he was coming from. This idea that love does not just heal personal relationships, but that love also heals the collective, the political, and the spiritual. That is what Gandhi said, and with that he succeeded in removing the colonial powers of Britain from India, and that is what Martin Luther King said, and with that principle he formed the civil rights movement, which ultimately overturned white supremacy and segregation in the American South. And it has to do with the idea that we must be as much changed inside. And we all know the line from Gandhi, you must be the change you want to see happen in the world. So the idea of turning love into a political force is nothing new. That's what Gandhi was saying, and that's what Martin Luther King was saying. But as important as it is for us to learn history, and I'm a lover of history, and as much as I feel knowing the narrative is extremely important, those of us who are practitioners, who are students, who understand spiritual work and are trying to apply it in our lives know that the most important moment is the moment that we're living in. Now, there was slavery in the United States, and then, as I was saying, the narrative is that we tend to self-correct. There was slavery, but then there was abolition. There was suppression of women, and then there were two major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement. There was institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the United States, and then there was the rise of the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. There was genocide and cultural annihilation of the Native Americans, and there has been progress on this ever since, actually, interestingly enough, Richard Nixon. Obviously, we have much work to do, but even now, when you see generations, many generations, standing at Standing Rock, and there is a rising consciousness, obviously, not only of reclaiming the wisdom of the Native American peoples, but of also owning and atoning for and making amends for the terrible transgressions which have been perpetrated against them. I've had a career for the last 35 years in the same kind of books, the same kind of spiritual and religious practice that so many people here I know are already familiar with. And a lot has happened in the last 35 years. When I first started my career and I was talking about sort of just basics of Course in Miracles, universal spiritual themes and so forth, audiences would be filled with people for whom these were like new ideas. But that is no longer true. The era of data collection is over. We've all read the same books now. We've all listened to the same tapes. So you don't come to hear someone like myself or any of the other authors or speakers in this realm and so much hear something that you don't already know. So audiences are not so likely to say, oh, I've never thought of that before, but they are very likely to say, isn't that interesting? That's exactly what we were talking about at lunch. Right? Because we're all downloading the same stuff, we're all getting it, we all know that. Well, now I think it's time for a next movement forward. People say to me all the time on this campaign, you've changed my life. And I've said, I'm very grateful to hear that. Now, let's go change the world. I've never related much to the way this entire movement of higher consciousness in our era has gone in such an apolitical direction. Not only an apolitical direction, almost a non-political direction, even using, at times, this ersatz version of spirituality to justify political disengagement, which is outrageous, actually, because there is no political or spiritual tradition anywhere that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. Jesus did not come to say, love yourself. Love each other. So I don't know how all that happened. I was in Michigan when it happened. But from the very early days of my career, from the very beginning, the AIDS crisis was right in our face. So the idea of separating the spiritual path from addressing the sufferer in front of you, it was never, I couldn't even imagine it. And also I grew up in a generation where we read Ram Dass in the morning and went to an anti-war protest in the afternoon. You know, it's like when the young man said to me a few years ago, "You're just an aging hippie, Miss Williamson." He said, "You know, your generation, it was just sex, drugs, and rock and roll." And I responded by saying, "That was just part of the day." I said, "The rest of the day, we stopped the war. What have you done, young man?" So we never saw our spiritual, the upright, the cultural movement of the time, the musical movement of the time, the sexual movement of the time, the spiritual movement of the time never was disconnected in any of our minds, mainly because there was a draft. So that made a big difference because you couldn't disconnect from it. So we never saw it as disconnected from the American war machine or anything like that, particularly the war in Vietnam. So this split that has happened, which happened for a lot of reasons, including the fact that after the people who held aloft, when we looked at Bobby Kennedy and we looked at Martin Luther King and we looked at Eugene McCarthy, there were people who held aloft a spiritual vision within the political realm. And there was a religious left at that time, the Berrigan brothers and William Sloane Coffin. So it was so multidimensional. It was religious, it was spiritual, it was philosophical, and it was political. After the assassination of those leaders, and remember, I was very young. I was a little girl when Martin Luther King was assassinated, but I was old enough to register. He was killed in '68. I was born in '52, so I was 16. I wasn't really a little girl. I was a teenager. So we were registering everything that was going on, and when those assassinations occurred, and particularly when they then killed the students at Kent State, because that was us. That was us. So that was when you knew they were serious. That was when you knew they were serious. And there was a very loud, unspoken message. And nobody needed to say it. We got it. And it was, there will be no further protest. You will do whatever you want in the private sector, and you'll have a lot of choice there. You will have a lot of choice there. You will be able to buy the yellow one or the blue one or the green one. So you will have a lot of choice there. You can do whatever you want buying the blue one, the yellow one, or the green one within the private sphere. But you will now leave the public sphere alone to whoever it is that wants to control it so much that they are clearly willing to kill in order to do so. Because nobody looked at the Kennedy assassinations or the Martin Luther King assassination or anything like that and thought, oh, it was who they say it was. I remember when my father came home, I had just seen on television that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, and I ran up to my father and said, Daddy, they killed Martin Luther King. Somebody killed Martin Luther King. And I remember my father staring out into space and saying, those bastards. And I thought, how did he know? What does he mean, those bastards? Does he know who did it? He didn't have to know who did it. He knew it was those bastards, right? So I grew up at a time, and it's interesting because I think I speak for a lot of people of a certain age, where you begin to feel you're a keeper of the stories. Not only the stories that have happened so that you know the historical narrative, but one of the things I feel, and I'm sure other people my age want to feel like sharing as well, some of the BS and the crap and the near fascism and the corporate greed and the acquiescence to the corporate greed and the legitimized bribery, system of legalized bribery that our country, our government has become. Kids, it wasn't always like this. It was not always like this. It's not like it was perfect. in my lifetime or in any lifetime. But there was a time when we knew that overreach by capitalism was something you were supposed to push back against. There was a time when we realized that corporations were not some big brother that was supposed to get their way at the expense of everything else. There was a time when we really took more seriously, it seems to me, that ethics and character and goodness applied as much to the public realm as to the private realm. And this is one of the reasons why, in terms of the higher consciousness community, it has been disappointing for me over the last few decades to see how some people in the higher consciousness community have actually fortified that silliness of divorcing higher consciousness from political activism. Because let me tell you something. If you know what changes one heart, you're the one who knows how to change the world. We are the last people who should be standing on the periphery. We should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. And by disengaging, and by so many people in my field being so more interested in brand protection than in laying down the truth as it actually applies to life, we have allowed ourselves as a field to be infantilized. And too many people in our community, who should be, as I said, the biggest grown-ups, have become the boys and the girls rather than the men and the women. And I know as individuals that's not who we are. I know that we're the ones who know how to deal with the sociopath. We're the ones who know what delusion is. We're the one who knows what narcissism is. We're the last people who should be quiet. So I figured, hell, run for president. It wasn't really that simple. But I thought it made for a good moment to present it that way. And so I want to talk to you tonight about what a politics of love is. A politics of love, to me, means taking all the principles that so many of us have applied to our own personal lives for years now and applying them to the collective. It's no different. All that a nation is a collection of individuals. So the same psychological and spiritual and moral and emotional principles that prevail within the journey of a nation prevail within the journey of an individual, prevail within the journey of a nation. The last book I published was called Tears to Triumph, and talking about what are the spiritual principles that need to be applied when we're moving through a personal crisis. All that I'm talking about now is those same principles applied to the country, because the country is moving through a crisis. First of all, let's remember that where there is love, all things are possible. Abolitionists would not have thought that abolishing slavery was possible, and women's suffragettes would not have thought, and I'm sure we're told by many people, that getting women the right to vote was not possible. There would have been people who thought ending segregation and institutionalized white supremacy in the United States was not possible. Now, all of these great social justice movements arose from spiritual and religious foundations. It was the early evangelicals in the United States and the Quakers who were the source of the abolitionist movement. Many of the leaders of this women's suffragette movement were Quakers, and of course the civil rights movement was led by Dr. King, who was a Baptist preacher. So religion and spirituality have never been divorced from the great social movements in the United States. Because number one, a religious and a spiritual perspective gives you two things that are extremely important in political change. First of all, you own your yes and you own your no. One of the things that I also feel has been a bit of a shadow side of the higher consciousness community over the last few years has been that our shadow is a denial of the shadow. There is evil in the world. There is evil in the world. Now, that doesn't mean, some people say, well, it just comes from fear. Yeah, it does just come from fear. And let me repeat, there is evil in the world. And no corner that will not take on that subject has gravitas. It's true. And but the religious, whether you're talking about Passover, where it's contextualized as the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt, or Christianity, where it is contextualized as Jesus on the cross, suffering on the cross, or even if it's not contextualized as evil, just the presence of human suffering, which if Buddha had not seen, he would not then have begun his journey to enlightenment. The real spiritual and religious worldview does not leave that part out. You don't skip the crucifixion and go right to the resurrection. That's not transcendence. That's denial. That's denial. And it might be sales, but it's not transcendence. So what the spiritual and religious perspective gives you is not only a recognition of the forces on this planet. That is what is symbolized by the crucifixion. That is what is symbolized by the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt. But also the human suffering that arises because of it. No, to be within the spiritual realm. You know, one of my favorite writings from Jewish wisdom is an old Talmudic and rabbinical saying, which is, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief." That sentence is so powerful to me. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. And then it says, you are not obligated to complete the task, but neither are you permitted to abandon it. So the spiritual path includes the recognition. That's why in Judaism the term is tikkun olam, to repair the world. There is no serious spiritual and religious walk that does not include the willingness to address the suffering of the world, and memo to higher consciousness community, not just yours. To recognize, but there is some other power. There is an equal power that comes from a willingness to be heartbroken, to not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. It is a power that comes from an unwillingness to look away. And this was Jesus the night before the crucifixion. Can you not remain awake with me in the hour of my agony? To bear witness to the agony of others. That is part. I remember when the movie Schindler's List came out. I didn't want to see it, but I felt like I needed to, that there was something, it was a moral responsibility to bear witness. There's something very powerful about bearing witness. But the spiritual and the religious power goes beyond that you recognize what's happening. And the Course in Miracles talks about the difference between negative denial and positive denial. So you don't go into denial about what's going on, but you go into what the Course in Miracles calls positive denial. I deny it power. It had power until I woke up, right? So that we know, and that's how America works. Even everything that's happening right now, ladies and gentlemen, will only stand if the American people remain asleep. There is nothing anyone can do. There is nothing that any political force in America could do. There is nothing that any political force from anywhere else in the world can do that can possibly take us down as long as we wake up in time. Because when we awaken, and we remember, no, I was sleeping before, but I'm awake now. I sort of took all this for granted before, but I don't take it for granted now. I sort of figured somebody else was handling this stuff, but I know better now. And I didn't really think that voting was that important, but I know better now. We will slam it like other generations have slammed it, and we will do them proud. Now, there is something else that the religious and spiritual force gives you. Not only that you refuse to look away, but it also means that you look through. Beyond this world, there is a world I want. So the abolitionists were not stopped by somebody saying, it's impossible. This has been going on for 2.5 centuries. The entire economy of the South is based on it. What are you talking about? You're not going to stop it. But that did not stop them. Number one, you don't try because somebody says it can't happen. Stephanie. You try because it's the right thing to do. That's what spiritual conviction is. You try because there's the right thing to do, and you know that there is a world on the other side of this veil of illusion in which it's already happening. Right? And so by your standing there, whether you are the ultimate form of the recipient of the attitudinal formation or not is almost irrelevant. It puts a chink in the wall. and it starts to tear down the veil. So you not only, so the spiritual and religious conviction means you own your no and you own your yes. No to what's happening and yes to what's possible. And you know that in the presence of love, as the Course in Miracles says, there is no order of difficulty in miracles. In the presence of love, anything can happen. The founding of this country, there's a quote from James Madison, the writer of the Constitution, author of the Constitution, who said, this Constitution is a miracle. It was a miracle. Abolition was a miracle. Women's suffrage was a miracle. Civil rights movement was a miracle. They were extraordinary changes in political unfoldment that only came about because of extraordinary changes, first in people's thinking and in people's bravery and people's courage and people's motivation and people's inspiration and people's commitment to making it happen. Now, how do you apply that to what's happening in America today? Well, the same principles. You have to look at yourself. Love means you can't go into denial about yourself. And first of all, like we said, you have to change yourself first. America has to look at itself. And that's what my campaign represents, and that's what this book is about. America, we need to look at ourselves. If anybody comes to me for counseling, by the time they come to me, and nobody comes to me for counseling because things are going well. Right? You've already talked to the doctor, you've already talked to the lawyer, you've already talked to the accountant, and you're ready to just be naked before God. Right? And just like get real. And that's when it starts. That's when transformation begins. So I want you to join with me in taking a deep look at America. Because until we recognize the places where we are not who we say we are, that's how we transform as people. You have to admit your character defects. You have to ask yourself, am I really the person I say I am? Do I really stand on the values I say I stand on? Am I harmless? Am I an instrument of love? Am I an instrument of peace? These are the kind of questions we have to ask ourselves if we want to heal our lives, and these are the kind of questions as Americans we have to ask for if we want to heal our country. First of all, right in our midst, maybe not in your neighborhood, but all over this country, there are millions of chronically traumatized children. Millions of American children who go to schools, many of which don't even meet minimum safety requirements or have functioning toilets. And they go to classrooms that do not have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. Now let's talk about what it means for these children. If a child cannot read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased. If a child cannot read by the age of 8, the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Many of these children, millions of whom live in what's called today America's domestic war zones, have a PTSD which psychologists tell us is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. But the returning veteran has post-traumatic syndrome. These children have present traumatic syndrome because their trauma is triggered and re-triggered every single day. So great is the violence in their homes, in their families, on their streets, and in their communities. They are children, they are among the 41 million hungry Americans. We have millions of American school children who go to school every day, food insecure. The food they get is from the food bank. We have elementary school students on suicide watch. We have American children who are traumatized before pre-K. We have American principals at public schools who are begging who have children in situations as horrifying as those I just described, who, when they ask if they could have a social worker sent to their school, are told by the state, well, we can't give you one, yours is not among the worst. I have met people all over this country, and this is true not only in this area, but in every area. It's true environmentally, it's true in terms of peace creation, it's true of everything. We know what to do to answer these humanitarian horrors. We have, just even in the issue of children, we have the people who know, the childhood experts, the early childhood experts. They know about the wraparound services, they know about the trauma, the anti-trauma, they know anti-bullying, they know conflict resolution, they know about restorative justice, they know how to teach mindfulness in the schools. They know how to develop the brain of an early child in such a way that that child can flourish. Do you know that we have public schools in the United States public schools in the United States, which don't have libraries because they can't afford them. And we know about how the arts, which so promote cognitive functioning, have been taken out of so many of the schools. And let's not kid ourselves. If a child won the birth lottery when it comes to financial advantage on behalf of their parents, then that child is likely to get a very good public education in America. If that child did not win the birth lottery in terms of that, however, well, listen to this one, because I don't think most of us even think about this. The United States is the only country in the world, and I'm sorry, the only advanced country, that bases the majority of our educational funding on property taxes. So that's why it is what it is. Now, what is the traditional political establishment doing about any of this? Well, you haven't heard it mentioned recently, have you? These children are just invisible. These children, the response of the political establishment is just to normalize their despair. They're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency, no votes there. They're not old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. And in a situation such as ours, which particularly since Citizens United has become little more than a system of legalized bribery, how can these children possibly compete with the corporate clout of those who really run our government, not who don't run our, but who influence our government so unduly with the corporate money that floods through the halls of Congress? It's not going to change, ladies and gentlemen, until the people step in. That's the thing. We need to stage an intervention here, because the traditional political establishment is not doing this. There is no money to be made. There is no money to be made from any corporate forces. Now, let me take that back. There's a lot of money to be made within the next 5, 10, and 15 years, because let's be very clear, the economic system we have has nothing to do with planning for economic abundance over the next 10 and 15 years. This is why we're the first generation where you stand to do less well than your parents. We're the first generation where life expectancy is going down. So this entire economic system. Once again, see what I mean about how higher consciousness people should be the first ones calling it out. It's like when you say to somebody, you realize he's a sociopath, right? You realize she's not where she told you she was last night, right? Because when you see these dynamics, they're just being played out in large. This is what gaslighting is. This is like, wow, nobody's talking about what's really happening. Yeah, exactly. Nobody's talking about what's really happening. We call that sick. We call that delusional. And so the whole country is like it's kind of like an alcoholic family system where the children are registering. I think there's some things we're not talking about. Right? And so everybody's kind of, I suppose everybody's a little bit anxious and tense, but nobody's saying it. Nobody's naming it. Everything I'm saying in this campaign, every Democrat who's running knows these things. They're not naming these things. Why do you think this is? I'll give you some time to think about that. So the issue is with these children. We now know, first of all, the economic system that we have, it's been with us for 40 years, Trickle-Down Economics. The idea that if you just give all your money to just a few people, see, it'll be really good. It'll be really good, see, because all the money will then trickle down and it will raise all boats. It has not raised all boats. It has left millions without even a life vest. It has decimated America's middle class. We have 40% of all Americans who have to struggle just to make ends meet for food and for rent and for transportation and for health care costs. And let me tell you something else about how this system works, because I think it's relevant for a crowd like this. And this is all going on a subconscious level. So it's not even like there's a group of bad people somewhere. It's not like that. And once again, that's why people we should be the first to get what's going on. It's on an unconscious level. It's how the ego works. They want just enough of you to do well. They want just enough of you. Once again, it's not a they like bad people. It's just how the mind works. But the system that perpetuates exactly the kinds of things I'm talking about, wants to make sure enough of you are happy, as in the best and the brightest, who should be standing up the most to say, this got to stop. But then they can say, what are you complaining about? You're doing fine. What are you complaining about? See what the thing is here, how it works here? Because that's how the system works. Once again, it's not even conscious. But you're a good person and you would care. So what do? They just pass laws to make sure that whatever suffering has to happen, it's on the other side of town. These children are in this town. These children are everywhere, but they probably aren't in your neighborhood. So whatever suffering has to happen is not in your neighborhood. It's on the other side of town. It's the other side of the world. Because if you saw it, you would care. Does that make sense? Now, the economic system that now dominates was devised before women had any voice in the public realm. And raising children was considered woman's work. But we have a voice in the public realm now. But we are spending too much of our feminist capital only on talking about ourselves. We need to also be talking about our children. And the love that will save the world is not just the love of our own children. It's also love for children on the other side of town and children on the other side of the world. Just like we're understanding that the love that will save the world is not just love for our own home, but the love for the earth, which is our shared home. One of my greatest quotes, given that it's Earth Day, the Dalai Lama said that a British physicist said to him that every nation on the earth should call every other nation its domestic partner. I love that. So these children, we now know things that we didn't know 50 years ago about what goes on in the brain of a child under 10. And now there's a lot of research actually about the teenage brain as well. The cognitive functioning, the cognitive elasticity, the neuroplasticity, the cognitive retention. If we really want economic power in this country 10, 15, 20 years from now, what we should do is take much better care of our 10-year-olds today. Every American child, no American child should be hungry. No American child. And our schools should be palaces of learning. They should be palaces of the arts. We have been trained, and this goes back to saying to you young ones, kids, you ought to do something, It's like the idea that in the richest country in the world, you have millions of American children who are trapped in the kind of trauma based on the things that I've talked to you about, and know that that the probability of the trajectory of their lives is incarceration or death. That's here, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not minimizing in any way what's going on at the border, and no group has a monopoly on suffering, and nobody's suffering is more important than any others. But it's interesting, our outrage that we will have about the children at the border, and yet there's something about these children right in front of us. Excuse me, they're here too. Not instead of, not more important, but certainly not less important, and it's made invisible. That's why if I'm ever president of the United States, we will have a cabinet-level U.S. Department of Children and Youth, and there will be a massive reinvestment in the direction of children 10 years old and younger. No business. So this is... we cannot heal spiritually, we cannot heal morally without being willing to address these breaks in our own behavior. And this is a break in our behavior collectively. The second one I want to discuss with you is race in America. Whether you're at an AA meeting and you have to take a fearless moral inventory, you have to look at the exact nature of your character defects. Catholics go to confession, Jews go to Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, Day of Atonement. All great serious religious and spiritual traditions include atonement, whether the word atonement is used or not. The idea that we have to look at ourselves and we have to admit where we are not the people that we want to be or should be, where we have a character defect. We need to admit it, we need to atone it, we need to make amends for it, and then, but only then, can we begin again. Racism is America's original character defect. As I said, it was with us from the very, very beginning. I don't think the average American is a racist. I actually don't. But I do think the average American is woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States. So what has happened, and I know I'm taking awfully long, so I have to be careful here. I want to wrap this up. There was 2.5 centuries of slavery in this country that was then followed by 100 years of what we would call today domestic terrorism. So at the end of the Civil War, after 2.5, so the first slaves were brought here in 1619. The end of the Civil War in 1865, there were between 4 and 5 million slaves. They were promised by Tecumseh Sherman, General Sherman, 40 acres and a mule for every family of 4, former slave family of 4. And think about this. You have to start over. How are you going to live? Okay, you're not a slave anymore. How are you going to live? Think what 40 acres and a mule would have done. You certainly have the skill set. You certainly know you've been running a plantation. You've been doing the work. You would know what to do with 40 acres and a mule. Most times it wasn't given. When it was given, most of the time it was taken away. And as soon as the federal troops left in 1877, the Southern legislatures began passing what were called the Black Code Laws. And the Black Code Laws were to ensure subpar social, political, and economic opportunities for black people in America. Then you have full-on what we would call today terrorism. What were lynchings, if not domestic terrorism? What was the Ku Klux Klan, if not domestic terrorism? Full-on institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South. This was not fundamentally challenged or altered for 100 years with the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King Jr. At that time, in 1964, the United States passed the Civil Rights Act, which dismantled segregation, the Voting Rights Act, which established full equal voting rights for black people in America, which in 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at, which is why we have all these voter suppression efforts today. The one piece that we have simply not gotten to yet, because we don't want to minimize the extraordinary efforts and successes and sacrifices of our ancestors. They fought the Civil War. They had the Civil Rights Movement, et cetera. But the thing that was never, it simply has not been completed yet, is economic restitution. Not only the economic restitution that is obvious at the end of the Civil War when you're coming out of a condition of slavery, but you and I think, would agree the moral responsibility that if you've kicked somebody to the ground, then obviously 2.5 centuries of slavery, and then another 100 years of domestic terrorism would certainly be kicking someone to the ground. If I have kicked you to the ground, I owe you two things. Number one, to stop kicking, and number two, to say, here, let me help you get back up. Ladies and gentlemen, since World War II, Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. Can't make the Holocaust not have happened, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, where every surviving prisoner from the Japanese internment camps during World War II was paid between $20,000 and $22,000. That's why, if I'm President of the United States, we will pay reparations for slavery. And I'd like to very quickly, before I move on, I want to talk in a spiritual sense why paying reparations is different than race-based policies. The concept of race-based policies leaves open the question of whose fault it is. Reparations has a spiritual force because it is an acknowledgement of a debt owed. And that's why it would have such healing. It's not just the money. Reparations is not just the money. It is the inherent mea culpa, the inherent acknowledgement that this is owed. Once again, just like with the Holocaust, it's not going to make slavery not have happened. It's not going to fix everything. Obviously, racial reconciliation is a multidimensional issue, but I know for myself, if you stole money from me, I appreciate the apology, but I'd also like the money back. The last one I want to bring up is, and it can't be all the money, obviously. I mean, you know, if you look at the dollar amount of 2.5 centuries of slavery and so forth, no matter how much money we're talking about, there are going to be those who say it's too much. No matter how much money we're talking about, there are going to be those who are saying it's not enough. That's part of that conversation, but I don't think that that's a reason why we should not try. The last one that I'd like to bring up is every bit as significant as the first two, and that has to do with national security in this country. We don't have health insurance, universal health insurance, because it might cut into the profits of health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies. We don't adequately deal with the climate crisis yet, because it might cut into the short-term profits of fossil fuel companies. We don't have common sense gun legislation. Why? Because it might cut in to the profits of gun manufacturers. And we don't have a national security agenda that is anything close to actually an agenda for peace in the world, because to do that might cut into short-term profits for defense contractors. And that is because we're not currently functioning as government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, for a few of the people, of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. So the State Department is the place that is supposed to be about humanitarian efforts and diplomacy, and then the Defense Department is supposed to be about preparedness for war. And obviously, I don't think any of us would argue that we need a strong military in the United States. None of what I'm saying is a criticism of the military. The decisions I'm talking about here are not made by the military. Many of these unbelievable expenditures were not even asked for by the military. And I'll give you an example. The U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes that are called the B-21 Raider. The B-21 Raider, each one of which costs $550 million. The B-21 Raider, each one of them, both carries conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. Now, I want you, not somebody else who must be thinking about these things. No, you tell me, why do we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear bombs? Because you drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it. You drop 10 of those, it's over for the human race on this planet, probably for 200 to 300,000 years. And I also want to remind every woman in this room that in the 20th century, and probably before as well, most of the people who died in wars were women and children, not masculine combatants. So the idea of women, not only is it with the children that we should be leading the charge when it comes to a conversation about taking care of our children, neither should we be somehow not taking part in the great conversations about foreign policy in the United States and our military policy and our national security agenda. Right now, for every dollar that we spend on genuine peace waging, it's estimated we probably spend over $1,000 and more for things having to do with, for instance, our $718 billion $718 billion in military expenditures this year alone. James Mattis, who used to be Secretary of Defense, said, if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, then I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. And Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush, said, we also must learn to wage peace. You can't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health. And you can't just prepare for war, you have to wage peace. Now, how do you wage peace? You wage peace with 4 factors that are known to diminish violence in a situation and increase peace, and they're not going to shock you. Number 1, expand economic opportunities for women, expand educational opportunities for children, reduce violence against women, and ameliorate unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. We should see large groups of desperate people as a national security risk, because desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people become more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. This is true, whether it's a gang, people in a corner of the United States being then vulnerable to gangs. It's true if it's people in another corner of the world being vulnerable to terrorist organizations, and it's even true here in the United States as well as elsewhere, people being vulnerable to the machinations of an authoritarian demagogue. These things are serious, and these things are changeable. But there is only one way to change them, and that is the only way things have ever been changed in this country, and the only way in which they're supposed to change in this country, and that is for enough of us. Us, not them, us, stand up and say, we won't be doing that anymore. You know, for those of us who have children, most people have children, if your kids are old enough that you've reached the teenage years, there's this thing that happens that most parents know, and it's this fierce thing that comes over you. They're in their teenage years, usually sex and drugs and alcohol is somewhere in there, and there's this thing that comes up, and you find yourself saying, that will not be happening in this house. Do you understand me? And you're actually laughing inside because you don't really know what you do if they challenge you at that moment, but there's such a fierce look on your face, they probably will not. We have to become that way about this country. Enough with the moral equivocation. Enough with government figures who, well, yeah, you know, that's true, but, you know, those corporate profits matter. No. Of the people, by the people, and for the people. You want to see a healthy, brilliant, amazing abundant economy, it's not going to be because you give more money to a few people who already have it. That's an aristocracy. Money's good. Money's not the problem. Making money is a good thing. The problem in America is not enough people have a chance to. Making money, creating wealth is a good thing. An aristocracy, however, is when your government functions in such a way to make it easier for people who already have a lot of it to make even more, and harder for those who don't have any to even make it at all. That is wrong, that is immoral, and that is what needs to stop. And this is not rich versus poor, because some very, very rich people agree with us, and some great corporate leaders agree with us. This is not about bad people, it's about bad systems. And a smug, self-righteous, intolerant left-winger is no better than, or no less dangerous to the emotional fabric of this country than a smug, self-righteous, intolerant right-winger. This is our time, ladies and gentlemen. I'm in love with history. And I think a lot about history. And I'm in love with my daughter, and I think a lot about my great-great-great-great-grandchildren. But we know where the power is. The power is in this moment. This moment. This is where the miracle lies. And as I said earlier, when it comes to our own spiritual practice, the era of data collection is over. One of the things that I ever since I was a little girl, I've loved to read biographies. I learned so much about reading biographies, because if I just read a book about history and I just read this happened or that happened, you know, it's dry. And that's so many people are bored by history because it's just a bunch of facts, right? But when you read about people, it's a whole different thing, and what they went through. And one of the things that I have gotten from reading about the greatest geniuses that have ever lived, that have done the most amazing things, they weren't perfect people. They didn't not hurt. They didn't say, well, I'm going to get it all together in my life and then show up. When Abraham Lincoln used to get reports about how many people died, when the Civil War began, 600,000 people died in the Civil War. 257,000 Americans died in World War II. And think how much smaller the country was at that time. They thought, both the North and the South, thought it was going to be like a little 6-week skirmish. When the first firings occurred on Fort Sumter, there were people in Charleston having a picnic watching. Neither side thought this was going to be what it turned out to be. And Abraham Lincoln, when he used to get reports of the people who had died in battle, used to put his head in his hands and rock back and forth and moan, I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it. And so to read about people like him, or like Martin Luther King, or like Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, who gave her entire life so that women could vote and didn't live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment. But every time that a woman votes in this country, I feel like her soul, wherever she is, her soul must tingle. You know, it's our turn. And I grew up with parents. My father was in World War II. That generation who fought World War II didn't come home and talk about it. But my mother talked about it. And one of the things that's very clear to me is that a crisis is never convenient. Pearl Harbor wasn't convenient. This is not about, well, I've got to get my career together, and I've got to get my money together, and I've got to get my whatever together. Get yourself together. And then everything else will magically follow. And you can't get yourself together today by pretending that what's going on is not going on because it's going on. And one of the things that I know about the crises in my own life, I think they've made me a better person. I think they've made me a more humble person. I think they've taught me things. You know, you learn things. My father used to say, you take the good with the bad. But sometimes it's going through those dark nights of the soul. This is why I have such a thing about over-pharmaceuticalizing a bad time. You know, not every bad time in life is a mental illness. And sometimes the fact that you're upset is a sign of mental health. This is not the time to pretend it's not so bad. This is not the time. This is not the time to desensitize ourselves. This is time to know, oh no, it's bad. But we're going to fix it because we're Americans. And sometimes Americans are slow. Sometimes Americans take a bit of a long time to wake up. But anybody on this planet, any person of goodwill, even those, and there are many, rolling their eyes about Americans now, also know if they know anything about history. We are slow to wake up sometimes, but when we do, we slam it like nobody's business. Ladies and gentlemen, let's slam it. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you.